Governor Poloz at this point. Mr. Poloz has been Governor of the Bank of Canada since June 2013. In 2015, he was elected Chair for both the Bank for International Settlements Audit Committee and the Consultative Council for the Americas. Born in Oshawa, Ontario, Mr. Poloz has over 30 years of public and private sector experience. An economist by training, he first joined the Bank of Canada in 1981 and held a range of increasingly senior positions over a 14-year span. Mr. Poloz then spent 4 years at BCA Research as managing editor of its flagship publication, the International Bank Credit Analyst. Mr. Poloz joined Export Development Canada in 1999 as Vice President and Chief Economist. From 2008 to 2010, he was responsible for all of EDC's lending programs, as well as the Economics and Corporate, as well as the International Trade Intelligence Groups. He became EDC's President and CEO in January 2011, a position he held until his appointment at the Bank of Canada. Mr. Poloz resides in Ottawa with his wife Valerie. He has 2 children and is a proud grandparent. Following Governor Poloz's remarks, he will participate in a Q&A session moderated by the Business Council's Executive VP and Chief Policy Officer, Jock Finlayson. From 2007 to 2013, Mr. Finlayson was a member of the Board of Directors of the Bank of Canada, where he chaired the Corporate Governance Committee and served on the Board's Human Resources Committee. Now, please join me in welcoming Governor Poloz.
Well, thank you very much for that. It's always a pleasure to be here in Vancouver, one of the greatest cities that there are. I've got a lot of friends here today, so thanks for being here. It's nice to see everybody. Well, these are uncertain times. There are uncertain times in the global economy, and anything that can be done to lessen uncertainty is welcome. Last week, the Bank of Canada, along with the government, joined with the government to take an important step to provide some certainty around both consumers and businesses by signing a 5-year renewal of our inflation targeting agreement. Now, this year marks the 25th anniversary of inflation targeting in Canada. Now, that's a long time. So long, in fact, that a whole generation of business leaders and consumers has not had to deal with the uncertainty associated with high and variable inflation. Now, it's human nature to take for granted things that have been around for a while, especially 25 years. Well, the Bank of Canada will never take for granted the benefits of inflation targeting. And last week's renewal makes it timely to remind people of the benefits that inflation targeting has delivered, as well as the difficult journey that we took to get here. Now, 25 years is a silver anniversary, but inflation targeting has truly been golden. As an approach to monetary policy, inflation targeting has proven its worth repeatedly, both in good economic times as well as in turbulent ones. And Canada was just the second country to adopt this approach. Now, inflation targeting, narrowly defined, is today being practiced by 36 central banks, representing about 37% of the world's economy. But when you add the U.S. Federal Reserve, which has inflation control as one of its mandates, and the ECB, which has a mandate to keep inflation below 20%. Excuse me. Mario would never forgive me for that. The ECB has a mandate to keep inflation below 2%, for the record. Then 64% of the world economy is following some form of inflation targeting. But to understand how important an advance the system represents, I think you need to look back to the bad old days of the 1970s and 1980s. I know some of us don't remember them, but I sure do. Inflation is not only much higher than today, but is also much more variable. A couple of examples. Inflation reached more than 12% in 1974, and then it dropped to less than 6% just about 2 years later. And then it jumped back to over 12% again in 1981. It was impossible to predict with confidence what the inflation rate would be from one year to the next. And from an employer's point of view, high and variable inflation made it extremely difficult to do the hard math required to run a business. High inflation meant companies constantly faced menu costs associated with having to regularly adjust their prices. Now, these costs, an extra cost of doing business, would typically be passed on to consumers, who also faced uncertainty about the future purchasing power of their savings. Now, the situation was bad enough in the 1970s that the federal government implemented wage and price controls, a drastic measure that's usually reserved for times of war. Well, they did not work. What ultimately did work were extreme monetary measures, interest rates that would make your head spin today. Mortgage rates rose above 20% in the late 1970s. I know that must be hard to imagine for the current generation of borrowers who are accustomed to 5-year mortgages below 3% and 0% financing at the car dealership. But that necessary monetary medicine was painful, and it worked. By 1983, inflation had settled into a range of around 4 to 5%. And back then, it would have been easy to proclaim mission accomplished. Lowering inflation was no longer a high priority for governments or for employees, especially unionized workers who could protect themselves with cost of living adjustments built into their contracts. Now, it was about this time that I first came to work at the Bank of Canada. We knew that settling for 4 to 5% inflation simply was not good enough. Canadians would still have their purchasing power eroded, just not as quickly. But at an inflation rate of 5%, prices still double in about 15 years, which means that prices would more than double over someone's normal retirement horizon. Now, back in the late 1970s, there was a near absolute consensus among economists and academics about how central banks should fight inflation. Control the supply of money, and you would control inflation, or so the theory went. Monetary targets would give clarity. It would give a nominal anchor to help explain central bank actions and provide the inflation outcome that we all wanted. Everybody understood that. The only problem was it didn't work quite as the theory predicted. Now, we worked really hard at the bank to try and save the idea of monetary targets, but the economy was changing rapidly, and new types of bank deposits were being introduced. And as a result, the relationship between the money supply and inflation proved to be too unpredictable to rely on. Now, I can tell you, it was quite a blow to the economics profession when, in 1982, then Governor Gerald Bowie famously dropped the bombshell that we would no longer target the money supply. The bank went off into uncharted academic territory, searching for a new way to control inflation. Now, we knew all along that interest rates and inflation are connected through a series of relationships, complex series of relationships, with money somewhere in the middle of that chain. So the bank focused its efforts on refining its understanding of the linkages between interest rates, economic growth, and ultimately inflation. In short, a macroeconomic model. In 1988, then Governor John Crow announced that monetary policy should aim at achieving and maintaining stable prices. And although that precise definition of price stability was still left open, the anchor for monetary policy would in fact be inflation itself, not some intermediate variable such as money. Now, it's fair to say that the concept of directly targeting inflation was met with a healthy degree of skepticism, including from the government of the day. After all, a central bank doesn't control how prices are set. And what made us think that we could achieve an inflation target? Well, we'd done our research and we'd improved our ability to use economic models, so we knew at least that the logic was sound. And in the end, the federal government was persuaded, and we reached a formal agreement that said that our monetary policy would be directed at controlling inflation, and it gave us the operational independence to carry out policy as we saw fit. And so, in 1991, Canada became an inflation targeting pioneer. Now, over time, the broad parameters of our approach really haven't changed. For the first 3 years, we had inflation reduction targets with a goal to bring inflation down from that 4 to 5% range down to around 2%. And we succeeded. And since 1995, we've aimed to keep inflation at the 2% midpoint of a 1 to 3% range. Importantly, we approach this target symmetrically. Given the experiences of countries who have struggled with deflation, we're just as concerned about inflation being below our target as above it. And we want businesses and consumers to be able to make long-term plans with certainty. Now, as it turned out, the framework worked better than we could have reasonably hoped. Check the numbers. Inflation averaged about 7% between 1975 and 1991. And that includes that 1983 to 1990 period when it had stabilized around 4 to 5%. But since then, inflation has averaged almost exactly 2%, and it has become much more stable. And expectations have become solidly anchored on that 2% target. Inflation targeting has also provided economic benefits that went beyond those that we were expecting. Canadian businesses and households have reaped the rewards of reduced uncertainty, helping them make spending and investment decisions with more confidence. It has led to improved economic performance across a number of dimensions, both in terms of higher levels of activity and lower variability in activity. The agreement, which has been renewed every 5 years since 2001, gives our approach legitimacy. And that's crucial in a democratic society. And having an explicit number for a clear target, like the inflation rate, makes it easy for others to judge our work. Importantly, the agreement also gives inflation targeting additional credibility, which has made it even more effective. And this credibility has grown with the success in hitting the target. Now, the combination of inflation targeting with the flexible exchange rate has given Canada scope to pursue a truly independent monetary policy, suited to our specific domestic conditions. And the framework has also given us flexibility to respond to economic shocks. So we could act aggressively during the global financial crisis, for example, because inflation expectations were so well anchored. And during the crisis, our framework provided an anchor that helped explain our actions. And it wasn't just Canada that benefited from all this, improved economic performance. This outcome was shared by many countries as inflation targeting spread, and that contributed to a period known as the Great Moderation. Now, that success did have a downside. The extended period of positive economic performance spawned rising financial imbalances. In short, we learned that while inflation targeting can bring about economic stability, that's not a sufficient condition for financial stability. But let me mention one more important benefit to this framework. Inflation targeting has made the Bank of Canada much more transparent. Now, from the beginning, we knew that inflation expectations would be important. If people believed we would bring about low and stable inflation, they'd behave in a way that would help make that happen. Now, it's become clear over 25 years that it's easier to anchor inflation expectations when people understand what the central bank is doing and why. And this has led to a steady evolution in our approach to communications. In short, more and deeper communications around monetary policy decisions. Now, back in Governor Bowie's day, communication with the public was not a high priority. 1 or 2 public speeches a year was pretty normal, with an occasional one by a deputy governor. Well, so far this year, our governing council members have given 17 public addresses like this one. These are broadcast live over the internet, and they're posted on our website for future reference. Now, there have been many other changes that also make us more transparent and accountable. 4 years after moving to inflation targets, we began publishing our monetary policy report, lovingly called the MPR, which explains in detail how we interpret most effectively. The second issue that we focused on was our measure of core inflation. Now, you know that prices can move for reasons well beyond the control of monetary policy. For example, a drought can lead to higher food prices. Now, we try to look through these movements and try to focus on what we call the underlying trend of inflation. And that way we don't oversteer monetary policy. Now, previously, we used one particular measure of core inflation, so-called CPIX. Well, we'll now use 3 different measures that get at the underlying trend in 3 different ways. So you can find out more information about these measures on our website. What's important is that our actual target is still built around total CPI inflation. These other measures are simply tools to help us do our analysis of inflation trends. The third issue we took on is how monetary policy decisions should take into account concerns about the stability of the financial system. And once again, we drew heavily on the experience of the past 5 years. We've now seen successive moves by federal authorities to mitigate the threat posed by imbalances in our housing market and associated high levels of household debt. Now, our view is that these so-called macroprudential policies are best placed to deal with threats to financial stability because they can be designed to target specific financial vulnerabilities. In contrast, adjusting interest rates to do this is a very blunt tool with widespread effects. And given all the work done to strengthen the global financial system over the past few years, it makes even more sense to separate monetary policy from efforts to stabilize the financial system. Now, that doesn't mean that our monetary policy ignores financial stability issues. For one thing, monetary policy is transmitted through the financial system, so we want it to be working well. But for another, we know that financial system vulnerabilities can magnify the impact of negative shocks to the economy, such as a large rise in unemployment. So, at the Bank of Canada, we take what we call a risk management approach to monetary policy. We acknowledge that there's always uncertainty around the outlook for inflation. And the developments in the financial system also bring uncertainties for financial stability. So these uncertainties together generate a zone within which we can tolerate variations in either the risks to our inflation outlook or risks to financial stability. And because there are many possible paths for monetary policy that can lead us back to our inflation target, and because we have the flexibility to take time that it takes to hit the target, we can use monetary policy to manage those risks while still keeping the pursuit of our inflation target as our main priority. Now, you can probably tell that, for me, renewing the inflation target is a cause for celebration. We economists are easily amused. But I think that Canada's inflation targeting framework is stronger than those in many other countries, and for a few reasons. First, the 5-year renewal cycle. It gives us a regular opportunity to do a thorough examination of our policy in light of experience, in light of new research, and to adjust it if necessary. Without the regular renewals, it would be much more difficult to introduce new thinking into our framework. Second, the renewal cycle brings an obligation to demonstrate to the government and to Canadians that we have the right policy. And this requirement means that the framework has strong credibility. And third, because the framework takes the form of an agreement between the government and the central bank, there's an explicit commitment from the government to support our pursuit of low, stable, and predictable inflation. The agreement, therefore, means that all economic policies, including monetary, fiscal, and macroprudential, can work together in a complementary fashion. But at the same time, I recognize that even after years of very low interest rates, the economic recovery in many economies remains weak. So it's not really surprising that some are questioning whether policymakers, including central bankers, are doing the right thing. Has monetary policy lost its effectiveness? Or is inflation targeting passé? Well, we take these debates seriously. We've studied the research and the theory behind alternative frameworks, such as price level targeting, or targeting the growth of nominal GDP. But to date, we haven't seen convincing evidence that there is an alternative approach that is better than our inflation targets. Now, I'm in no way suggesting that inflation targeting is perfect, and we will never stop looking for ways to make our framework better, to provide greater certainty to Canadian businesses and consumers. Well, this goes beyond the targets themselves to include the tools that we use to pursue them. Economic models remain at the core of the entire inflation targeting process. And models require investments to capture many new complexities in today's economies. In short, the next generation of economic models needs to be under construction now. After all, the main model used at the bank today is the culmination of nearly 30 years of research effort. Well, it's time for me to conclude. The renewal of our inflation targeting agreement is good news. And whether you remember the bad times or not, high, variable, and unpredictable inflation is deadly for confidence. It's a source of uncertainty that would be brutal in today's economic climate. And we will not let that happen. We have a record of more than 25 years as a successful inflation targeting central bank. This has helped businesses and individuals make financial decisions with certainty and confidence. It's led to an environment that's conducive to sustained economic growth. And the renewal of the inflation targeting agreement sets us up to extend this track record of success for another 5 years. But our framework is not set in stone. We will continue to observe and to learn, ask questions, and make sure that our monetary policy is truly doing its best until the next renewal in 2021. We'll be looking for new ways to engage with Canadians in a discussion about our framework, and would very much like to hear your ideas as we continue to promote the economic well-being of all Canadians. I thank you. Hello, Jock.
Good to see you again.
How are you? Good.
Well, thank you, Governor, for sharing your remarks with us. And let me just say, as somebody thinking a bit about retirement these days and not having an indexed public sector pension, I wish you every success in keeping inflation low and stable, and anything I can do to help you, if you'll call on me. I want to talk a bit about the juxtaposition of rapid technological change and innovation that we see in our lives as consumers. Is disrupting many of our industries, fundamentally changing the way business is done on the one hand, and on the other hand, a seeming reduction in long-term potential growth. We've seen this, a lot of work being done in the U.S. on this, recent estimates from the Fed economists pointing to U.S. potential growth somewhere between 1.5% and 1.75% over the long haul. Presumably it might be similar in Canada. How do we explain the seeming paradox of rapid technological improvement and innovation on the one hand and diminished growth potential on the other?
That's quite the lead-off question there, Jock. What's your next question? Any question with the word juxtaposition in it? I don't know. But anyway, seriously, you know, economists like to joke, and it's not really funny, but you know, for economists it's funny.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's you and me, right? Yeah. So, but the productivity is everywhere you look, except in the statistics. You know, you see all the effects of technology everywhere you go. And the truthful answer is we don't really know yet whether this is just a feature of the kind of adjustments our economy is going through, which it's there, but it's kind of beneath the surface because we have traditional parts of the economy going through severe adjustments. It's particularly the case in Canada, where we have a major headwind coming to us from adjusting to a lower price environment for many commodities. That's a drag on everything else. And so it means that the kinds of productivity things you might like to see are actually there, but they're beneath the surface. Others think that the statisticians still need to do more work to catch up to some of these things. And there's probably some truth to all of those things. But I'm confident, I know we have the best statistical agency in the world, that our statistics are up to the task and will begin to reflect this as it becomes more prominent. But at the core of your question is a concern about really slow economic growth. And that's, even though there might be good productivity, we're in for a slower growth scenario than what we got used to. And that's primarily a demographic thing. So for, you know, baby boomers like us, you know, we kind of impacted the economy, the global economy, for a period of about 50 years. So anything that happens for 50 years, that sounds like forever, right? But it's not. So those baby boomers, as you mentioned, are contemplating retirement, and many are already retiring. And so we get a slowdown in the labor force happening in Canada and the United States, and frankly, in most other countries. So the world economy is slowing because of this. And Canada will have a potential growth rate on the order of 1.5%, similar to the number you mentioned for the U.S. And but that 1.5% includes an assumption that we get the typical close to one, say in the sort of half of that growth would be from productivity, technology. So it's not zero in that framework. It's important. So what do? Well, we can boost it. You know, we take some more of the impediments away that are slowing growth down, or we invest in more technology, and that productivity line will continue to go. And infrastructure, things that help businesses grow, will all boost that trend line. And right now, when we're starting at 1.5, every decimal point counts.
Well, that leads my next question, which is about business investment. Even accepting that long-term growth potential is somewhat lower than it might have been in previous decades, investment in the private sector in particular does seem very, very sluggish, not just in Canada, but in fact across the OECD. I mean, economists, some are pointed to the growth of regulation and policy uncertainty is hindering investment. Others say it's actually a lack of aggregate demand, which means firms are reluctant to expand capacity. The Monetary Policy Report published earlier in October flagged weak business investment as a concern. What does the analytical work that the bank has done bring to the surface in terms of trying to explain the multi-year weakness of business investment in Canada?
So again, you've touched on what is not just a Canadian or American phenomenon, but a global phenomenon. And so in part, it may be a little bit circular. The slower growth that I just talked about, the trend line globally, means that companies need to invest a little less than before in order to maintain their capital stock for that future economy. And furthermore, we have these disruptions, which you say, well, we have the terms of trade shock, the drop in oil prices and other commodity prices. Some of that capital stock is no longer economic, and so it's still in the capital stock, but it's not productive, and you're not going to invest more in it and maintaining it or whatever. So investment slows down in a pretty big sector of the global economy, and actually the spillovers into manufacturing and other machinery type sectors. It's hard to track, but it's obviously there. We could talk to people. But when we talk to companies, the most important thing they tell us that's holding them back, many of them are close to capacity, so they figure any time now they need to think about, if I'm going to grow my business, I'm going to have to invest some more. Very many companies are in that spot. But the uncertainty that's in front of them every week, it seems like there's something to say, well, let's wait and see when that clears up. Lately, they mentioned the U.S. election, what it means for NAFTA and those kinds of things is a key uncertainty. But it could be for another company, some form of regulation that's not sure how that's going to turn out. There are all kinds of sources of uncertainty. In fact, there always have been. But it seems, given what we've been through, people are particularly put off by the uncertainty. And even if the CEO is ready, the board might not be, to make a big spend. So we're confident that all the ingredients are there and that this will come to dominate our outlook. Oh, in fact, I believe it's happening. So we won't know really till we see more data from the second half of this year into the new year. Part of our economy is growing quite well, and it's just being still held back by the negative adjustment in the resource sector. Once that negative adjustment is over, the positives could be much more dominant. And the U.S., I think, went through a lull in the first half, and that really kind of put things off. It really added to this uncertainty, and now it's showing its strength again. So all the ingredients are present, so we're watching it closely. We don't want to assume it will happen, though, because, frankly, it's been a long haul, and you've been expecting it for some time, so we're being cautious in our interpretation of that.
If we look back over the last number of years coming out of the 08-09 crisis and global recession, central banks all around the world responded by pushing their policy rates really to record lows.
Yeah.
I remember those days quite well. I mean, nobody, I think, remotely envisaged in 2008, 9, and 10 that 7 years later, we would still be looking at the kind of interest rate environment that we have. And I know you've given a couple speeches touching on the need for investors to maybe rethink their assumptions about returns, but also for businesses, and this speaks to one of the questions on the pigeonhole here, to maybe recalibrate their expected ROI on investments. Can you elaborate a little bit on that theme, because you've touched on it in a couple of speeches recently?
Absolutely. I think that's a really important message for people to understand. It goes back to your first question too, Jock, that if demographics are, of course, that's arithmetic. That's not economists making forecasts, right? We're going to be a year older next year. You know, that it's not rocket science. So what happens is the economy slows because of that input. And as a consequence of that, that's one of your primary ingredients to the equilibrium or the long-term real inflation-adjusted interest rate. That productivity plus that growth in population will find an equilibrium where the economy is growing. Say you said around 1.5%. That's a reasonable number to have an assumption in your model, and that means that the real rate of interest will also be around that neighborhood, much lower than what we had in previous years. And so when you add a couple of percentage points onto that for inflation, you're into a much lower nominal interest rate for returns at the short end than what we got used to. And so I think people need to recalibrate that base, if you like, the risk-free rate of interest when deciding, given the risks of the project that they're contemplating, what's a reasonable rate of return to be demanding out of it. And, you know, that all depends on your perception of the risk in it. I get that. But when I hear stories of, you know, companies, boards insisting that anything we do has to at least give us 10% or those kinds of things, what I think is they're going to end up not having any opportunities. Someone else is just going to buy that opportunity from under them, someone who understands this and is willing to take, you know, say a 5% return on equity or something instead of insisting on a much higher number. I think as we get older, I think 5% is going to sound like a really strong number.
Switch over to China for a minute. I've read actually a couple of papers done by your research staff kind of trying to map out the long-term outlook for China. Obviously, it matters hugely for Canada, for BC even more. We've seen China, you know, increase its profile as a provider of capital, as a source of immigrants, and obviously as a market that we're selling into. A lot of concern among analysts and economists these days about a so-called hard landing scenario in China due to the rapid buildup of debt, huge amounts of overcapacity in some of the manufacturing industries, distortions in their economy from the still very prominent place of the state-owned enterprise sector, which really absorbs a lot of the capital in China, and the bumpy effort, I guess, by the Chinese authorities to kind of restructure their economy. Right. What's the bank's outlook on the medium-term prospects for growth in China?
Well, that outlook is fundamentally a positive one, Jock. We of course understand the points you're raising that make it look risky. Those risks are present in many economies, not to mention our own. Many of them are present in lots of economies. And but everybody's investing in strengthening their financial systems so that those things aren't magnified if something happens, that they can be contained. That's a big move compared to 10 years ago. We weren't really prepared for that kind of shock. Having lived through it, the global financial system is far safer than it was back then. And in terms of the actual economic fundamentals, China is moderating just like everybody else, but moderating, since given its size, if it grows 6% or more, which is kind of our working outlook, that's a really big addition to global demand every single day, far bigger than what we were dealing with 5 years ago at a higher growth rate. So there's a lot more new demand from China as a result. And so I think we're a little bit overplaying this moderation. And the moderation is one which will make China's outlook more sustainable, not less. So I think it's much more balanced and more the sort of a growth track you'd rather see than one that's inflated in various ways, you know, a little bit too much. But at the end, I got to say, it's one of our important risks. Okay, if there were, you know, a problem in China, whether probably a financial one, that would be something that the world would see quite immediately, and Canada being a resource exporter in particular. So we don't minimize that. That's an important risk that you raise. We're watching it carefully, but I think it's going to be quite a comfortable thing.
I see some audience interest in the theme of climate change. I know you're not responsible at the bank for Canadian climate policy, but maybe I'll come at it this way. There seems to be a lot of interest by policymakers and governments around the world in accelerating the shift to a low-carbon future. There's agreements that are being reached. Some jurisdictions, like our own here, are putting a price on carbon. To what extent does this factor in thinking about where the global economy is going to be going over the next 10, 20, and 30 years? Because we've had a global economy that hasn't been carbon constrained
Right.
During my career and yours, but it looks like that's going to shift, and it might shift actually pretty quickly
Right.
over the next 5 to 10 years. What are the kind of macroeconomic implications, if any, from that kind of a change?
Well, so we haven't done a lot of advanced thinking on this. We can see, though, that this is on the horizon. And so just tentatively, what I want to make clear is that it's not unambiguous, right? So there's, any time that there's a change like that, it's basically a relative price change, and it's not that different from the terms of trade shock that we went through over the past 3 years. So you're going to have a shock like that, which affects some parts of the economy negatively and other parts positively, because there'll be a lot more investment in green technology in that scenario. And we have lots of emerging companies in Canada that are in that sector, big space for us. And so, the economy will be different, not necessarily stronger or weaker. And I wouldn't want to be pinned to any call at this stage. It's something for modeling. When the time comes, as we start to contemplate those fundamental changes.
There's audience interest as well in, it just says Brexit with a question mark.
Brexit.
I'll phrase it. This one of those kind of surprise shocks that came along.
Yeah.
Obviously a much bigger deal for Britain and the UK than it is for us. But it does seem to me there's quite a bit of uncertainty over the next 2-3 years about how that sorts out in Europe. And to what extent is that going to act as perhaps another hindrance to global demand growth and economic expansion?
Well, you put your finger on it. That's exactly the way we think of it. It's more uncertainty for businesses. If you think of the UK or Europe as key to your market, or if you have a presence there, or if you have an investment there, these are front of mind, these questions. And but right now, I don't think it's possible to make a call on how that's all going to turn out. It certainly looks like it's going to be a pretty gradual process from a business point of view. And like any other shock, businesses will reoptimize around whatever model looks like it's emerging. But I think for now, it's be foolish to speculate on what the conditions would look like, and therefore crank it back into what it might mean for the global economy. It's just way too soon to say.
It's a final question, and then we'll have to move on. I'm a member of the National Statistics Council. One of the things we worry about a bit is whether the economic data that's being collected is actually providing a sturdy foundation for analyzing what's going on in the economy. And I'm speaking here of the rise of the so-called digital economy,
Right.
the sharing economy, the rise of the gig labor market, all kinds of things that are happening very quickly that I think our traditional systems of data classification and collection weren't necessarily set up to address. To what extent is that challenging the ability of policymakers to really deeply understand what's going on structurally in our economy, or do you feel you've still got an adequate handle on that?
Well, boy, you're full of them today, aren't you?
It's the last question.
Yeah. So, but it's just a very serious matter, and you're right to point it out. I mean, for us, the macroeconomy is already a difficult thing to measure and to understand all its fluctuations. This adds another layer of complexity to that. I have a lot of faith in our statistical folks. Just in fact, met yesterday with the chief statistician, and they're talking about their efforts around the digital economy, the sharing economy. All these things are right on the top of their mind, and so I have every reason to be confident that they will incorporate those in our macro statistics in a way that does it for us. The trade front, I understand, is an important place where they're investing in their methods. As you know, trade and services is one of the harder things to track, and many of the things you talk about are of that sort. And so all across that range of things, Stats Canada is investing heavily in order to improve the way we refine those data points. And so they'll give us the data, we'll do the job.
Well, thank you very much. The clock literally has run out. I want to thank you for being so generous with your time.
My pleasure, John. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.